This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
Welcome to Japan on Film Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a returning guest today, and that is Derick McDuff. Derick, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here talking about a real classic with you.
Absolutely, yeah. Today we are going to be talking about Akira Kurosawa's Ikiru, which is one of my favorite of his movies. But before we get too much into that, it's been a while since we had you on the show, so why don't you remind people about who you are, what you do?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, name's Derick McDuff, and I host a podcast called the Underrated Movie Podcast, where every other Monday, myself and a guest will discuss a film that is underrated, underappreciated, or one that has passed under the radar. And so, yeah, I have a lot of fun with that. Just had first panel at Comic-Con recently. All that stuff is just wherever you listen to podcasts, however you're listening to this. Look up Underrated Movie Podcast or on all the social media apps, and it'll come up and talk about some hidden gems.
Hold on, I think you buried the lead a little bit there. What's that about a panel at Comic-Con?
Yeah, I about a month ago as of recording this now, Underrated had its first ever panel at Comic-Con. It was called Why Films Go Under the Radar. That was a blast. I got to host a panel about underrated movies at Comic-Con. Had a lot of really good panelists there. So yeah, that was a blast. That panel is up on the podcast feed. It's also on my YouTube channel. So if you just look up Underrated Movie Podcast on YouTube, you can check that panel out in its entirety. And yeah, so got to be at Comic-Con. It was a really cool moment. It was really, it was really surreal.
Congratulations, that's really awesome. I got a friend of mine who had tried to get on a panel who tried to get a panel greenlit at New York Comic Con and wasn't able to. So you had some stiff competition there. So good on you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was going to get it, but it worked out.
Awesome, very cool. So as we mentioned, today we are going to be talking about Ikiru, and so we've had you on before, but last time we talked about one of Kurosawa's films, I think on your first appearance on the show, if I'm not mistaken, when we talked about Sanjuro. But remind me again.
We talked about Kagemusha.
Oh, you're right. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, yeah. Kagemusha. I talked about Sanjuro on another episode. But before we get too much into Ikiru, and and also to remind myself and the listeners who may not remember when we talked about, obviously, since I can't even remember the name of the movie we talked about, what was kind of your history with Kurosawa?
So he's kind of always been a huge blind spot for me, right? He's one of the few kind of old masters that I had never really delved too much into. In fact, I didn't watch my first Kurosawa movie until a couple years back, and I watched it was Hidden Fortress because I was really curious about the parallels between Star Wars and that, and obviously they're definitely there. But he has so many films, it's kind of overwhelming. It's like, where do I even start with this guy? And so I've kind of been using your show as a little bit of an excuse to finally get around to watching some of these movies of his that I've been meaning to watch for years now.
Cool. And obviously, Kurosawa is the gateway for a lot of people when it comes to a lot of Japanese movies. Famous director who's had a lot of very influenced by Western movies and Western stories. That Yojimbo's arguably probably not his most famous movie, but at least one of his most famous movies, and that was very clearly Western inspired. He took a lot of inspiration from John Ford Westerns, and obviously the basis of the story was basically Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest. And then, of course, Seven Samurai, which everyone I'm pretty sure knows now, was adapted into the West as Seven Samurai. Yojimbo itself had an unauthorized adaptation in A Fistful of
Mhm.
Dollars. And then later on, we got Brick, which is also an adaptation of that same story, although that was authorized when Ryan Johnson bought the rights to Red Harvest.
I did
So,
not even know that Brick was an adaptation.
oh yeah, it's straight up an adaptation of Red Harvest, and I believe if I'm going half off memory here, so I might be, and this is memory going back several years, so I might be incorrect, but I believe that Ryan Johnson did purchase the rights to Red Harvest himself so that he could have a full authorized adaptation of that.
Interesting. Real fast tidbit. When Ryan Johnson was shooting Brick, he's a San Clemente local. I went to San Clemente High School. He was shooting it while I was going there at on weekends, and there's a couple of my friends who are in that movie. So that was my high school, and I was currently attending it while that movie was being shot there. And then it premiered at a movie theater that I would later go on to work at in town.
Wow, that's really cool. The closest I have is my high school's football field was the football field they use at the end of Breakfast Club.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
but that
Okay.
but that was
The
obviously
yeah.
shot way before I went there. Yeah, it was actually filmed at I went to Maine West High School. That was actually
Mhm.
filmed at Maine North High School, but the football field is actually Maine West football field. Or at least that's what everybody tells me. I've never read a confirmation of that anywhere, but everyone says it's Maine West Field, and you look closely if you know the for those who know who are from the northwest suburbs of Chicago, you might recognize what I'm talking about. But anyway, let's jump into Ikiru. So what's when was the first time you saw this movie? What's your familiarity with this movie?
So yeah, I first watched this movie for this podcast, and it was one that, like I said, I've been meaning to get to so much of his stuff, and I feel like this might be an oversimplification, but I feel like there's kind of two flavors of Kurosawa, whereas there's the kind of like epic historical ones, like Kagamishu, which we covered last time, and I was really interested to kind of talk about that side. And then there's the more contemporary, modern for the time at least it was being shot, Japan, you know, that are less about swords and action, more about kind of Japanese life in the 50s or whatever, or 60s, how whatever it might be at the time. So I was really curious to dive into that, which I had never done before. So when I saw your big list of movies, I was like, you know what? This is one. It's considered one of the all-time great movies of like history, and it's something that I have never really gotten a chance to delve into. Not just this movie, but like that whole side of Kurosawa. So I was like, all right, let's go. And so I watched it just for the first time a couple nights ago.
Okay, very cool. So you're coming in completely virgin to this. So what was your impression of and well, when you and yeah, you're right. I think there is those two different flavors of Kurosawa where you've got the much more the epic stuff, which I think arguably you could say he kind of built his name on.
Hmm.
Those are probably what people most think of when you think of stuff like Yojimbo or Seven Samurai or Hidden Fortress, Kagemusha, etc. Uh, and then you do have these smaller movies which are much more contemporary, much more rooted into the problems of the time they're being made, or even if they're not rooted in the time they're made, they're a reflection of stuff that was happening around the time. Like for example, Redbeard was, historical fiction, but it's much more similar to things like Ikiru and Drunken Angel than it is to things like Yojimbo. So was this your first experience with those I guess I don't really want to say smaller, but maybe more personal of Kurosawa's films?
Yeah. It was my first experience with that because I'd only seen a couple of his works and they were all samurai movies. This one obviously not a samurai movie. So it was my first kind of uh, delve into that side of Kurosawa, which was I thought really interesting because Japan, in the 50s is such an interesting time period because Japan, is interesting because it is kind of a East meets West culture, and this was really when that was starting to really take root, post World War II, and this country, which, and I think that's something that's present in the movies, certainly, this country, which is so built on tradition and stuff like that, was becoming westernized in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So, what did you think of this movie? What was kind of like your big overall impression of this film?
Yeah, I thought this movie was absolutely fantastic. Obviously it's a very famous movie. I knew the basic premise of, there's a guy who finds out that he only has a couple months to live, and I know it's based on the Russian novel, and then there was the English adaptation a couple years back starring Bill Nye, and so I knew the crux of it. But I really didn't know where it was going to go on a micro level. And it took some turns that I was definitely not expecting. I was like, when he starts parting with that author, I was like, oh, is this just going to be the whole movie? Is it going to be a one crazy night movie? It's not that. Then it, kind of becomes something else when he develops a friendship with the young woman. And I was like, okay, is this going to be the movie? And then, spoiler alert, he dies with about 50 plus minutes left. And I was like, okay, where are we going now? And then it kind of obviously becomes like Hitchcockian in that last act where the like breaking down what happened, how he was able to do all these things, get the park built, because it ends with him just kind of like, or not ends, but the second act, I guess, ends with him being like, all right, I'm gonna make a change. I'm resolved to do this now. And then you see them kind of going back through in a very modern way of like, let's look at the beats. It's all these characters at his wake talking about it. And talking about, and you get to see the glimpses of him. He hears him going to the side, hears him, before anything happened to it, it's just like a muddy, gross pit, almost like Parks and Recreation vibes. It gave me a little bit. It's a very similar, with the Parks Department and stuff like that. And then them filling it in, and then finally that famous shot, of which I had seen the shot, I'd seen the poster of him sitting on the swing 1,000 times, but I had no context for it, and getting the context was pretty spectacular. So yeah, I can see why this movie is considered one of the all-time greats.
Yeah, absolutely. And I first encountered this, like I first watched this movie after I'd come to Japan actually. And one of the things that struck me right off the start was the office setting, because at the time I watched this movie, I was actually working in a Japanese city government office. And what struck me is how little things have changed in the so this was back so this movie took place was released in 1952. I first came to Japan in 2008. So I probably saw this movie in somewhere between 2008 and 2010 and 2010 is probably when I first saw it. So you're talking about a time period of almost 60 years, and it was like nothing was different. The only thing different from the office that Watanabe was in and the office I was in is that we did have some more modern technology, and by modern, I'm talking like late 90s style computers, right? So it wasn't even
Right.
that modern by those standards. That was it. But like the over reliance on like papers and and stamping personal seals on stuff, all of that was still completely part of the zeitgeist there, and still continues to be to this day in a lot of ways too. So that was one of the things that struck me first. And what you mentioned too about the latter half, or not the latter half, but like that third act, and how Watanabe dies at the end of that second act, basically. And then the entire third act is basically this series of flashbacks, which you really get a feel that uh, Kurosawa was leaning on the techniques he had kind of developed when he was making Rashomon, which came out in
Yeah.
1950.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a very similar feel to that. And I never thought about the Parks and Recreation comparison, but you're absolutely right. Like the whole idea of there's this cesspool in town that these residents want to clean up, and there's just all this bureaucratic bullshit they have to wade through. That is completely out of the first season of Parks and Recreation. I'm pretty sure, like, I would not be surprised if Greg Daniels and Michael Schur didn't watch this movie and think, what if this idea was made into a comedy? Because that kind of
Hmm.
seems what the feel of Parks and Rec is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, speaking of how that, obviously is a comedy, this is obviously a drama, but there are some very funny moments in it, like that whole beginning montage where it's the people who are trying to get that pit filled, or the sewage filled in, or whatever it is, and they're going around. It's go to this department, go to this, and it just keeps going and going and going. And it's very funny, and there's a lot of like pretty good humorous beats throughout this movie peppered in. But it does a really good job of never losing the tone of what it's doing. And, it's because it's on one hand, it's saying like, this bureaucracy is kind of like not a great thing, people just become this guy who at one point, it tells us that he had like these ambitions and dreams and stuff like that. He's kind of just become this cog in the machine, or like essentially a mummy, as to use the term that's used in the movie. Um, but then he kind of, ironically enough, gets life spurned into him when he finds out he's about to die, and that kind of pushes him. And he has some moments that are very funny. He has some moments that are very heartwarming. He has some moments that are incredibly tragic. That moment when he's trying to tell his son that he has cancer, and his son just kind of starts lashing out at him. And by the way, his son sucks. Like, fuck that guy. He's the worst. Um, but yeah, like it really does play on all these different emotions. It really will tug at your heartstrings and make you laugh in the same scene. Um, and yeah, so I can see how it would be an inspiration to so many different genres.
Yeah, and I especially want to talk about Takashi Shimura, who plays Watanabe in this movie. But
Mhm.
that opening scene you're talking about, and having dealt with the bureaucracy of Japanese city hall, that is that is not exaggeration. That is full 100% true to life. Like that is
Mhm.
just it is completely accurate. Like I have had to do that where I get bounced around to different departments, and then finally at the end you're like, "Oh, you have to go back to the first department you went to." It's like, "Motherfucker, come on." Like we have a saying here that the Japanese didn't invent bureaucracy, but they perfected it, and that is 1000% accurate.
Yeah, that's pretty funny because yeah, I think it does a really good job of portraying that. And that kind of that churn, and how he's not like a bad person, and like the other people working at that department are not bad people, but they've just kind of become these walking corpses who don't really ever get anything accomplished. There's that whole thing about, I love the line that his friend has where it's like, it's not like City Hall where you can just do nothing for like all day. I do more like in an hour than you guys do all day, or whatever she says. And that's very true, because they're just kind of like stamping. They're just moving things just to move it. She has that joke about he's never taken a vacation in 30 years, not because everyone would miss him and the work would slow, but because they would realize that the opposite is true, that nothing would make it wouldn't make any difference. And then when he starts putting all this effort into it in just the course of 5 months, he may, by really applying himself and going against this bureaucracy, he makes such a profound, powerful change. And I love that the last shot of the movie, you know is seeing the change that you see him in the park and getting to see his reaction to it. But then you see his legacy afterwards of all the kids sitting there enjoying it. And then I love that you see kind of someone with a hat, and it's like, is that like, I know it's not his ghost, but it's like maybe supposed to be implied that it could be, or something like that. Or is it son? Someone wearing a similar hat, kind of overlooking, watching it all and seeing, the impact that he was able to have. And it really speaks to that, if you have, like, you can have these passions and go out and do these things. And there's that line about, well, if the bureaucrats are like, well, we would have done it if it would have happened to us. And it's like, well, do it then. And they're like, yeah, we'll do it. And of course they just go right back to the same bureaucracy afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah. I taught this movie in one of my film classes one time, and actually dug up the questions I had here, and that
Mm,
was exactly something I mentioned in the in my questions, was the fact that at his wake they're all drunk, and they're all emotional, and they all vow, they're like, we're gonna change, we're gonna follow what Watanabe's example, we're gonna try and work the system and use it to benefit the people just like he did. And then the next day, what do? They fall right back into the old habits. And it just kind of, and it's it's a bittersweet movie in that
mhm,
aspect, because there is all this good that Watanabe was able to accomplish, but
mhm,
it's only the fact that he was about to die, and then he decided he was finally going to do something. And like you mentioned, you have Toyo, the I don't know if she was a receptionist or just a general office worker or what she was, but she was working at City Hall, this young woman. And and she quit her job at City Hall, and then she started making toys. And she says that when she's making toys, she feels like she's playing with every baby in Japan. And that was and like you said, she talked about how she does more work in an hour than they do in like a day or a week or a month or whatever it was. And that's 100% true. Like it's
Mhm.
and here's the thing about this too, and you see this too in other fields like education, you see this in politics and so many other fields where you have these service minded individuals, right? You have these people like Toyo, or, and I'm thinking about more modern politics in the case of, we're recording this at the end of August. People won't be hearing this probably until about the end of the year, if not early next year. But one of the things that I'm reminded of is, you look at some of these people in Congress, like you had Cory
Mhm.
Bush and oh god, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he was Jamal Bowman in New York, who were very strongly civic minded. They had this real idea of improving things for their constituents, and then they get forced out because of money and bullshit and all that. And then you see someone like Toyo in this movie, and she's someone who actually cares about helping people, and she just gets frustrated by all the bullshit bureaucracy that she ends up quitting, and she ends up finding something else to do. I had a friend who was an English teacher here in Japan, and she was a great teacher, great very kind woman, and she ended up quitting teaching because it was just she just got tired of all the bureaucratic bullshit. And it's just it's so sad to see that back in 1952, Kurosawa was talking about these things, about how this bureaucracy grinds down the people who really want to be there and really want to make a difference for the people. And but then it makes it easy for people who are lazy or opportunistic to come in and take advantage of the system and to basically not do anything to help people.
Yeah, and I really thought that that was a profound. I like, like you mentioned, it was pretty bittersweet at the end. I do like that he seems to have made a difference in at least one person's life. There is the one guy who is kind of like everybody's kind of through the whole wake. Everyone's like, oh no, like he was important, yeah, but it was really a whole thing. And the one guy keeps pushing back, and he's like, no, like he was really instrumental. Like this was his thing. And at the end, at that last scene when everyone starts to revert back to their ways, he stands up and kind of like looks like, are we really doing this? Didn't we just say that we were gonna like stop this bullshit and we were gonna make a change like he did? And they all go back, but it seems to have made a difference in his life. So I really like that moment, and I like that we at least get to end with, you know, it's not gonna like it's more realistic. It's like it's not gonna change overnight. Not everybody's gonna change because this one person made a difference, but there is still a spark. And I really thought that was pretty profound. And because I didn't know that this is the way the movie was gonna end. I knew that he was gonna die and that you know that was gonna be the thing, but I really thought that it might be he's just gonna have this kind of like you know the point the him to live would be him going out and having all these great experiences, all these things that he's never done because he's never taken a day off work. And I really thought that that whole thing with the novelist and the night on the town, like it was going to be like he's going to jump on a jet ski. I don't know what he's going to do. It's going to be something more like that. Because like if I found out that I was on, I'd be like, cool, I'm going to go skydiving, whatever. But he becomes completely selfless, and because the first thing that the novel says, he's like, yeah, greed is good, and sometimes you just gotta live for you. And so he kind of goes along with that for a while, but then he's like, you know what? I'm gonna give back to everyone else because he's been just saving his money just to save. Like he essentially has no reason to save his money. Like on its face, he's doing it for his son, but and it's something I feel like crops up a lot in American films of especially of like the 80s and 90s of you're just kind of like Castaway is a movie that I think does this really well, where you're out there spending all your time like making this money for your family, for the people you care about, but in the process of doing that, you completely lose your family. Like he barely knows his son. He's not like his son is going in for I think is getting an appendix removed. It's like a flashback to when he was a kid, and he still goes into work. So I thought that whole message about the corporate grind and doing your job just to do it and just to make money and he doesn't even know how to spend money. I thought that was really accurate of the way that a lot of people in the world operate, especially in the 21st century. But it was clearly something that was starting to take root, particularly in Japan in the 50s.
Yeah, it surprises me how not only have things not gotten better in that aspect, in many ways they've gotten worse. So
Mhm.
it's really kind of it's really kind of depressing to see that we haven't really learned these lessons. And this was, I think, the no, not the first one, because Drunken Angel came out in 1948. But you see these movies like Drunken Angel, you see this movie Ikiru, and then you see Redbeard, which came out at towards the end of his career, or at least it was the last one he did with um Mifune. And one of the things that we talked about Drunken Angel and we talked about Redbeard on this show before, and one of the things that struck me about both those movies is they both had similar themes and ideas to Ikiru. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen either of those movies, but one of the things that struck me was how, like, Redbeard was the first, Ikiru was the second, and then or not Red, Drunken Angel was the first, Ikiru was second, and then Redbeard came along after those three, those other two. And what struck me very much in all three of those is that I feel like, and I don't know if it's just that the idea of like originality biases, like whichever one you saw first, the one that sticks with you most. But Aikido was the one of those three I saw first, and that's the one that kind of stuck with me the most. And it does have all these similar themes in it. And one of the things you talked about is also too. I mean, let's also think about the chronology here, because this movie came out in 1952. It's set
Mhm.
in that contemporaneous time period. That's only 7 years after the war, and 1952 was the year that Japan became independent again. It became a sovereign nation, right? That's the year that the American government officially withdrew and Japan took over its own self governance. Thing is, Watanabe has been working for City Hall for 30 goddamn fucking
Mhm.
years. So that's long before all these changes brought about by, like, SCAP took over in what, 1945, around there. I think, yeah, I think the bombs were in 1945, and then that's when Japan surrendered and SCAP took over later on that same year. So the end of 1945 up until 1952. So that's what, about like 6 or 7 years roughly, give or take. And he was working for 30 years in this office up in total. So he's like 1952 it came out, so that means like 1932, around that, right before the war. So back when it was still Imperial Japan, and it's the same shit. Nothing has changed. Even with even with Japan going from a fascist imperial state to a burgeoning democracy, on the bureaucratic city level, nothing has changed. It's still exactly
Yeah.
the same.
No, that's really funny. That's something I was thinking about too. It's like, so yeah, he started this job out under like the emperor, in the 1930s or whatever, was stamping things the whole time through the war, and then all this. And I was thinking about like too. So his wife, they mentioned that his wife died 20 years ago, I believe is what they say. So that means that he's still, even when his wife was alive, and that's kind of like implied to be when the kind of like creative spark or whatever went out of him. But even before that, when he had his plans that are not now tucked away in the drawer or whatever for like changing the city, even the 10 years before that, he still didn't miss a day. He was still sitting at his desk. Even when he was, as the movie kind of puts it, still alive, he was really still locked into that bureaucratic mold, that kind of just soul crushing thing. And it's something that I think about a lot with jobs. It's part of the reason why I don't want to have an office job. I prefer being like a writer and having these side hustles and a job where I can afford to do that. So yeah, it's really just and he never takes vacations, anything like that. So yeah, it's really fascinating to see what his trajectory must have been. And it almost, and I feel like in a way, mirrors Kurosawa's trajectory, because he, I think, got started probably around making movies around the same time, if I'm not mistaken, in like the 30s, and he's just kind of been, and he was a workhorse. He's got tons and tons of movies. So I wonder how much of this is him, like, putting his own, like, oh, I've been just kind of like working and working and working. If he, any of that, like in the same way that like James Cameron in Way of Water is like, maybe I wasn't the best dad for my kids, and he put that into Way of Water. I wonder if any of his personal life bled through into this.
I haven't done. I know only a little bits and pieces of his personal life, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case because, I mean, we do know that Kurosawa did struggle with depression. He had attempted suicide at one point too. So I think that's very. I think that's very, very likely that he was putting a lot of himself into this movie. And what you mentioned too about the the job situation, and I was thinking about this too as I'm thinking about this movie, and my mother had recently come into town in Japan, and we were kind of talking, and she was asking like, well, why did you ever consider coming back to America? I was giving her all the reasons why I don't want to do it, and she's like, well, what if you got like and I was saying like, well, teachers in America, they make pretty much about the same as what I'm making here in Japan, but here the cost of living is much cheaper, so it's going to be a much more comfortable lifestyle here. And she's like, well, you could always get like a regular office job. And I was thinking back to the time when I did have a regular office job when I was and it was for like maybe 3 months. Dude, I tell you, I was ready to stab my fucking eyes out. It just drove me nuts. All the passive aggressive bullshit, all the like, the nonsense, different regulations, and just I just remember like all the different types of emails and stuff like that. And just kind of like, God damn, I hate every single one of you motherfuckers. It's just like Office Space painted a friendly picture of corporate life as far as I'm concerned. That's what I was thinking when I had to deal with it. It's like I do not want to go back to that world again. And yeah, doing like freelance teaching stuff where I just go in, I teach my classes, then I go home. Maybe I don't make a lot of money, but I get to spend time with my kids. I get to have time alone with them. I get to not deal with endless meetings and bullshit and like that. And just like I'm a lot happier that way. And I think that this is something, and it's not just me. This is something that's been growing in Japan over the past like 20 years, where there are a lot of people, young people, who are deciding to eschew the kind of like corporate drone mentality and just kind of doing like these lower paying side hustle type gigs, because while it doesn't give them as much financial stability, it does give them more free time and more peace of mind. I think there's something to be said about that. And the fact that, again, 1952, this movie came out. And I sometimes talk about movies that came out in the early 2000s in Japan or in the 1990s in Japan, but this came out in the 1950s and these problems are still here.
Yeah, absolutely. It does feel something that is not only timeless, but it's also universal. This is something that, while like you said, being made in Japan 1952, feels very relevant to things that people are experiencing in 2024 in America. Like it is something that, like, my brother who has an office job, he's always just like, don't sell your soul to the corporate devil like me, man. And he makes a lot more money than me, but he's also just like fucking miserable at his job. So and it's something that this movie I think really hits on, and he's only able to break out of that corporate bullshit thing when he starts upending all the conventions that are expected of him. It's like, oh, well, you don't say no to the deputy mayor or whatever. And he's like, well, I'm going to, because he knows that he only has so much time to live and that he has to do this. And that is something that the movie's telling you. It's like, you might not just have 5 months to live, but all of our time is fleeting. It might be 5 months, it might be 50 years, but at some point, that time limit is going to hit. And you better hope that you used it well and that you made an impact in the world.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to talk more about this, but we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will talk more about Ikiru.
Este episodio es presentado por Honda. Descubra la nueva Honda Passport Trail Sport Todoterreno. La Passport más todoterreno que Honda haya imaginado jamás. Esta Passport cuenta con mayor altura al suelo, barras de techo en todas sus versiones y neumáticas especialmente diseñados para cualquier terreno. Además, disfruta todos tus viajes con el control de clima de 3 zonas, techo panorámico y opciones como asientos delanteros con calefacción y ventilación. Conoce más en honda.com/passport.
Empower. Claire is practicing her breathing for her upcoming yoga retreat in Bali. Has she ever done yoga before? No. But Claire worked with Empower on her savings and investment strategy. She got good at money, so she can be a little bad. Empower. Invest well, live a little. Join our 19 million customers today at Empower.com.
Past performance is not indicative of future returns. Investing involves risks. You may lose money. Advisory services are provided for a fee by Empower Advisor Group, LLC, EAG, a registered investment advisor with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Om Namaste.
And we're back, still talking about Ikiru with Derick McDuff. And one of the things that you had mentioned that I wanted to touch on was the sequence with the author, and he takes him out, to all these kind of like hedonistic type of situations, right? Takes him out, drinking, gambling. They go out to the dance hall, and it's just that Watanabe just feels so utterly lifeless in those scenes, and in fact, maybe even more lifeless than he feels at the office. Like and it struck me as so interesting because these types of activities, drinking, gambling, dance halls, or what would be the more modern equivalent would be like hostess bars or that kind of thing. And he
They
goes
even go to a
these
strip club at one point.
or strip. Well, yeah, strip club. That's kind of like the equivalent of like the hostess club now. Strip clubs they exist in some parts of Japan, but they're not as common. I think the hostess clubs, the cabaret clubs, those are probably a little bit more common, at least as far as my experience. I know they exist, but I've never seen them like in my area, for example. But yeah, what struck me is that these are the kinds of things that, a lot of the Japanese, the salary men, right? The corporate types, the corporate office types. These are the kinds of things they do to go out and blow off steam. And it really shows something about Watanabe's character, that he just has zero interest in any of this stuff. And like you said, like just like the creative spark of life has gone out of him since he wrote that report about like this idea for changing the city, and for changing the way the city deals with the citizens. And it's just like that none of this other stuff holds any interest for him. Whereas you think about some of the other people in that office with him, they probably would have been having the time of their life out with that author.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And because I was really curious to see where that would go. Because I really liked that author character. I thought that was an interesting sequence, and it was kind of just showing that, yeah, like you said, this is something that doesn't really hold an allure for him, and it's something that he's never, like he says, he's never bought a drink for himself, and and it's interesting because I like that he kind of gets to experience that side and that option and realize, like, okay, it's always kind of fun when you like go and do something once. It's like, okay, cool, this was interesting, I'm glad I got to experience, but this is not for me. And then you kind of get to hone in a little bit more on what is for you, and because I'm the kind of person who will, like, I will try an experience once, and if it's not for me, cool, I'm glad I got to do it. And I feel like that was an important thing in this movie, because otherwise people are like, well, why didn't he go out and just have fun and stuff like that? And it's like, that's not what's important to him now that he knows that he has this limited amount of time. So I found that to be all a really cool sequence of the movie.
Yeah, and also that song he sings. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say also, just quick thing. I don't know what it was, but that game with the pinball, like gambling, that seemed cool. Like, I don't know what that was, but it seemed rad.
So that's called Pachinko, and it is actually the dumbest fucking game I've ever played in my life.
I've always heard of Pachinko, but I never knew what it was. Okay.
It is so stupid. Okay, like if anyone here is listening who is a Pachinko enthusiast, please email me and explain to me the fascination with it, because I've tried it twice, and both times I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea why this is fun. This is just bullshit.
But yeah, you mentioned the song, and because I think that was a really important moment. That was a really cool moment.
Yeah, Gondola no Uta, which is the gondola song, basically is what the literal translation would be. And the lyrics here, I'm going to read through some of them that translated into English. Life is brief, fall in love maidens before the crimson bloom fades from your lips, before the tides of passion cool within you, for there is no such thing as tomorrow after all. Life is brief, fall in love maidens, before his hands take up his boat, before the flush of his cheeks fade, for there is not a person who comes hither. Life is brief, fall in love maidens, before the boat drifts away, on the waves, before the hand resting on your shoulder becomes frail, for there is no reach here for the sight of others. Life is brief, fall in love maidens, before the raven tresses begin to fade, before the flames in your hearts flicker and die, for today, once past, is never to come again. And, he's singing the song, and he sings it twice, right? And it's just very different versions that he sings. Like the first time he sings it, it's it's like this incredibly sad song, and it's like this kind of feeling that he's singing. It's a much more melancholy tone he takes with it, where it feels like he is expressing his regret for not having lived his life the way he wanted to. And also too, you talked about the fact that his wife had died, and given the time period and all that, it's fairly likely, if not almost certain, that his marriage with his wife was probably an arranged marriage, right? He's this middle class guy. He's got this, this city job. So he's probably comes from a decent family, right? You're talking about like the early 19th century Japan. So, the feudal, even though feudalism was technically gone, it was still the DNA was still very much integrated into Japanese society. So it's very likely that he had probably had an arranged marriage. Him and his wife probably didn't have some sort of like passionate courting period or anything like that. It was probably just this thing where it's an arranged marriage. They're forced to marry each other. It's kind of this thing where they kind of learn to live together more than anything else. And there are examples of that where those were couples who had been in an arranged marriage. They end up falling in love with each other over time, but there are just as many examples where they don't. But the fact that Watanabe feels so uncomfortable in the author's hedonistic lifestyle shows me that even though he was most probably in a loveless marriage, he wasn't like a lot of men at that time fooling around on his wife. Like, it doesn't seem like he had a mistress or anything like that. He just seemed like he was 100% devoted to his work. Like you mentioned the fact about how when his son had the appendix removal, he was working. So it does seem like he was just very much a workaholic and didn't have any time for any sort of leisure activities whatsoever, or anything that even made him happy. And just like that, and that song he sings, and where he realizes basically, I have wasted my life, and then you compare it to when he's sitting on the swing and he's singing at the end of the movie, and he's singing the same song, but now he's content, right? Because he feels like, I have done something that has given my life meaning after all this time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he doesn't stop being a workaholic after he gets his diagnosis, right? He does for like a couple weeks or whatever. But then once he finds that passion, that thing that he is trying to do, he becomes just as much as a workaholic, if not more, than he already was, right? So it's not necessarily saying that like, oh, like delving into like just working and stuff like that is a bad thing on its face. It's about finding a passion, finding something that you care about, and making a difference rather than just being in this bureaucratic churn. And to speak on that song, I thought that was both times it's sung hauntingly beautiful for different reasons. Like it kind of that first time it comes at the end of this very hedonistic night, and everyone kind of just like stops and looks at him, and they're all like kind of like, and on one level it's like you're kind of killing the vibe, but another level it's like, wow, this is like really profound almost. Everyone's kind of like looking at him, and at the end it's really just like this perfect pin on the movie, the perfect little button to go out when you bring it all back. And I really like the choice of the song too, because they mentioned that it's a song that is not a contemporary one. Like somebody says, oh yeah, that old song from like the 1910s or whatever. And so I like that. It's interesting because in this movie, which is now from a bygone era, this song is from a bygone. It's almost like watching Harold and Maude or something, where like, yeah, like now Bud Cort is like an old guy, but then he was young and needing somebody from this older era. So it's almost like a Russian nesting doll of like past like past things to look back on. Like this is an old movie that's referencing an old song, and it shows once again that he is really from this other era.
Yeah, to put a fine point on it, it came, the song is from 1915, which was the Taisho era in Japan, and this is, so yeah, the song itself is from the Taisho era. Then the period following that is the Showa era, which was when the Showa emperor, which lasted until the late 1980s, early 1990s, I think was when the Heisei era started. But one of the interesting things about the Showa era is it's basically divided into two halves, right? You've got the first Showa era, which was World War II, and then you have the second Showa era, which was after World War II, the post-war era. So you've got the wartime era and the pre-war era and the post-war era. So basically you've got him essentially going back almost 3 eras because he is right at the start of the second part of the Showa era in the post-war era period. So it does, you're all right. It does have that kind of nesting doll feel to it as a result. And also too, you're right. I'm glad you mentioned the reaction of the other people because it's, yeah, on one hand you can look at it as like this, okay, you're kind of killing the vibe, dude. You're bringing out this, you're bringing out this this song from years ago. You're singing it in a very depressed way, and it's like, have you ever seen, okay, this is a weird reference, but it's on my mind now
Okay.
because I had recently done a binge watch. Have you ever seen the Veronica Mars movie?
Oh yeah, I actually was talking about that today with somebody.
Okay, so good timing then. Great
Yeah.
minds. So you remember the when they go into the karaoke bar and that one crazy girl is singing the Bonnie DeVille song and it just kills the entire vibe of the karaoke
Yeah.
bar?
Yeah.
It does kind of remind me of
Yeah.
what was happening in this scene in
Yeah.
Ikiru
Yeah.
because it was that same kind of idea. Although the difference is everyone's just kind of like, you just are completely out of place. You're just bumming
Mhm.
everybody out with this shit because this girl just died. But here it's just kind of like, this is an old song. You sound like you've had a little bit too much to drink, and but then on the other level, it's, you kind of see this realization come over each of the people, and they're
Mhm.
just kind of like, holy shit, what are we doing here?
Mhm.
And it was
Yeah.
kind of like, that was kind of the feel that I got from it as well.
Yeah, no, totally. It's funny because yeah, you mentioned Veronica Mars, which I'm a huge fan of. I love Veronica Mars. This the karaoke vibe that it reminded me a little bit of was I don't know if you ever watched The Leftovers, but there's a very famous karaoke scene in the episode International Assassin where somebody kind of just like has to sing this song and it's kind of in like the vibes are just kind of like weird. So that's what it reminded me of. The Leftovers. I don't know if you ever saw that, but I highly recommend it if you haven't.
I've only seen a few episodes of it, and it was one I always meant to get back to, and then I canceled my HBO Max subscription when they shipped it
Yeah,
to
yeah.
Max and all that. So that's something
Fair.
I have to get it on my list again eventually. Thank you for reminding me about that actually.
Yeah, for sure.
Um and let's see, what are things I want to mention here about this movie? Oh, you know what I want to talk about was just Takashi Shimura's portrayal in general, like, because
Mhm.
again, 1952, this movie came out, and he plays a similar character in Drunken Angel, where he plays this doctor, but he's kind of this acerbic character. He's more of a Dr. Cox type from Scrubs than anything else
Okay, okay.
in that movie. And just 2 years later, he plays this part, and he looks so old in this movie, right? And just looks so beaten down. But then you look at some of the movies, because you would be forgiven if you had looked at this movie and some of his other famous movies, like for example, Godzilla came out in 1954. Seven
Mhm.
Samurai also came out in 1954. These other movies where he plays these much more dynamic characters. And you look at Ikiru 1952, and you would have been forgiven for thinking that this movie came out at the end of his life. But this came out before some of his more dynamic performances. And it's just like
Yeah, that's interesting.
he's a master. He was a master of his craft.
It's almost like Christopher Lloyd, I feel like, has been old my entire life. You know, like he was like I'm like, how old is like in Back to the Future came out in 1985. He's like, I'm like, oh, that's an old dude, like, and now it's like, oh, how old is Christopher Lloyd? I have no idea.
No, I think that's a good comparison. Yeah, absolutely. And well, I mean, remember he was in Kagemusha when we talked about that, and he
Mhm.
seemed more dynamic in that movie, which came out in 1980
Oh yeah,
than he
wow.
seems in this movie. And he died in 82, so he that was just 2 years before his death, and he died
Mhm.
at the age of 76. So when you think about it, like, he was born in 1905. This movie came out in 1952, so he wasn't even 50 when he made
Yeah.
this movie, but he seems so much older in it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to something that I was thinking about going into this movie, and why it's a movie that I've always wanted to watch but never gotten around to it, because it is feel like, okay, this is like a kind of maybe slow story about like an old man kind of dying and stuff like that, and doesn't have a lot of like, it's not like a Godzilla or a Seven Samurai, these other movies of like contemporary movies in Japan, especially the one all these ones that you mentioned that he was in that were also directed by Kurosawa, like, and so those movies feel a little bit less like homework. You know, it's a little bit easier to just turn on Seven Samurai, even though it is a movie from the 50s. You know, like they have subtitles. You know, at least for me, somebody who doesn't speak Japanese, it feels a little bit like okay, you can just kind of turn that on, where it's like I'm not just sitting around being like, what should I watch right now? I feel like watching Ikiru. You know, like
Mhm.
I've never had that moment, which is obviously why I've never watched this movie. But like something like I think like a Citizen Kane, which is another movie that I did not get into until like post pandemic, that is this all time great. I was like, man, this thing moves. Like this is it's. I was worried it was going to be homework, but it wasn't homework at all. It was not one of these movies like I know people love it, but like The Godfather, I watched that. I'm like, this is homework. You know, it's got exciting stuff in it, but this movie did not feel like this is something I need to watch because it's important. I'm actually really watching this movie. I'm very engaged.
So I do agree with you on this movie. I will quibble with you about Citizen Kane and Godfather. I think Citizen Kane
You
definitely
would
feels
flip
like
that?
homework to me. Yeah, I would flip those.
Okay.
Absolutely. Citizen
Okay.
Kane totally feels like homework. I recognize how groundbreaking it is, how important of an achievement it was in cinema, but at the same time, that movie bored the shit out of me. Whereas
It's
Godfather, I feel like moves. So there we
funny because I
definitely have
had
a
the
difference of
exact
opinion.
opposite experience.
But I will agree with you about Ikiru. Like this movie, despite it being such a in theory slow movie, right?
Mm,
And such, in theory something that would feel like homework. I mean, another example of it would probably be Requiem for a Dream. I love that movie, but I
mm.
am not going to watch that movie again because it is just so utterly depressing. And I
Oh
don't
yeah.
I don't need to see that movie again. It's one of those things
I'm
where I
never
saw it once
watching
and I'm
Grave of
fine.
the Fireflies again in my life. Once was
Oh
good.
God, no, that's another one too. That's another one too. Very, yeah, another good example. But this one, it does move, and there is a
Mhm,
beauty to it. So yeah, I definitely feel where you're coming from with that. Also at the wake, right, where you
mhm,
have all these city officials who are patting themselves on the back for and they're all talking about what a great man Watanabe was and all this kind of stuff, and they're all patting themselves on the back for the work they did with the park. And then you had the citizens come in, and they're like, fuck all of you. You didn't do jack shit. It was all Watanabe. He did
mhm,
everything. Like I thought that was a brilliant way of illustrating just kind of like even the minor class divides within this city.
mhm. Yeah, and I mentioned that end kind of felt Hitchcockian, but it might even be more apt to compare it to something from like Sidley Lumet, where it is all these like really good character, like all this great character dialogue and interaction stuff like that, and, and it's moving the plot forward and it's interspliced with flashbacks. It was almost like you know 12 Angry Men, another movie that feels like it should be homework, but that thing moves, and in the same way, especially that third act when you're like, okay, I kind of like looking like there's still like you know like more than a third of this movie left. The main character is dead. What is this even gonna be? And that was almost when the movie was at its most frenetic and it was moving at the quickest pace, which I thought was really masterfully done.
Oh God, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot going on in that wake scene, which all basically takes place in that one room, and it's a lot of long shots. Like there's not a lot of quick cuts in that scene at all, and it just on paper you would feel like that would drag. And it kind of
Right.
reminds me too, like, have you ever seen Tokyo Story?
No, I haven't seen any Ozu. It's on my that's like top of my list.
So Tokyo Story is also one of those movies that when someone suggested it to come on the show and talk about it, like going into it, I thought it was going to be homework. I'm like, I understand
Mhm,
Ozu's a master, but I'd read about him and how he likes like these very long takes and he likes to focus on this human drama. And I looked at the runtime of it and I'm just like, oh, this feels like it's going to be a chore. But it moved. It was actually
mm.
very exciting, even with like all the long takes and all the kind of like slow dialogue. It was strangely compelling the entire way through. And I feel like Ikido, especially that last sequence, has a very similar feel to it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And then it's interesting you bring up Ozu because I think that Kurosawa is somebody who is clearly very influenced by Ozu, by these old masters. There's a lot of stuff like him breaking the 180-degree rule in this movie and stuff like that that was clearly done by Ozu. But he's also somebody who, as you mentioned at the top of the show, is also very influenced by Western films, by Western culture. And where you have Seven Samurai being a very the Western genre influenced film, and then of course the Western genre remakes that film, and then remakes that film. So it's like this cyclical, interesting thing. So that's what I love about Kurosawa is that he doesn't just pull from one source, right? He pulls from his own country's films, but he also looks at films across the world. And I think that's what all the really great filmmakers do, which is why, of course, later in his life, in the episode we talked about with Kagamishu, he was building these friendships with people like George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, and they were able to help him keep these films getting made late into his life when people in Japan, studios and producers in Japan were not there for him. These other Western influences were. So, like any great filmmaker, it's really a mosaic of different things that have kind of influenced this movie.
No, absolutely. I think that's and something else you had mentioned at the beginning that this was recently remade with Bill Nighy. Have you
Mhm.
seen that movie?
I have not. I hear he's really good in. I think he got nominated for an Academy Award.
Okay, yeah. I have not seen it myself too, but I was curious about it to hear what it was. I think it's or Living is what it's called.
Yeah, yeah.
Is the title of it. And it says it received positive reviews and yeah, with Nai's performance getting a particular acclaim. So I am curious to see how that movie would have interpreted. Um
I almost
cuz I'm not
watched it for this, but I was like, I'll just keep it purely the original.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
want to like
I can understand that. I do
bias
kind of
myself.
wish that one of us had watched it so we at least have
Yeah.
some basis for comparison. But no, I mean, it's got a 96 on Rotten Tomatoes. So obviously it's gotten a pretty good response, which is much better than the majority of remakes of Japanese films get. So I
Mhm.
am much more curious to check it out now compared to before. And I am kind of surprised that nobody thought to remake this film before because it
Mhm.
does, even though it is very much centered on Japanese bureaucracy, like this kind of bureaucracy is not unheard of in other countries. Like obviously the UK found it, but I could see, like, my mom was in town recently and she was talking about dealing with the Social Security office, dealing with healthcare stuff and all that. I'm just kind of like, and then when I'm watching this movie again, I'm thinking like this is the same kind of idiotic bureaucracy she was describing too. I mean, you could easily see this type of story fit in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's based on like a Tolstoy novel, which was written
That too,
in the
yeah.
1880s. Yeah, it's written so like that kind of speaks to like, okay, well, this is Japanese bureaucracy, but it's based on something where it was Russian empirical bureaucracy. So
Mhm.
it is something like we said, and we talked about how it's something that's relevant in 2020 for America. Obviously, it's relevant in 2022 England as well. So or 1880s Russia, it's something that kind of crosses borders, and I think that speaks to once again him drawing all these different influences from everywhere, and that's why I think a lot of his films have been remade officially or unofficially sometimes by a lot of Western studios.
Yeah, yeah. Is there any other final comments you wanted to say about Ikiru?
I think yeah, we pretty much hit everything that I wanted to get to.
Yeah. And well, I just one final note about it. I forgot to mention that the translation. So, the literal translation of the word Ikiru is to live. And
Right.
and I think originally when it was first released in the West, it was titled To Live, but over time, like in the Criterion Collection, which is the version I have, it just ended up being called by its original Japanese title of Ikiru. And just, this is just kind of a silly question, but what do you kind of think about that idea to use the original Japanese title on Western releases of it as opposed to doing a translation of the title?
Yeah, I always think that's interesting. I always kind of like wonder like what's the thinking with that? Because I'm actually working on something. I work freelance for Watch Mojo, and I'm running this list about international cinema right now. And I'm just like, okay, I'm always curious about why does this one get translated and this one doesn't. And me being my biggest touchstone with Japanese films has been Miyazaki, and so I'm always just like, okay, like for example with The Boy and the Heron, there was a lot of hullabaloo about why did it get translated that way, like How Do You Live, I guess, was the original translation, but then they changed it to Boy and the Heron because they were like Western audiences will understand this more. But then you have something like another like portrait, like or like with Celine Sciamma, right? She's a French filmmaker. Portrait of a Lady on Fire gets an English title. Her next movie, Petite Maman, does not get an English title. So it's always one of the things I'm like, I never understand the reason, I guess is the answer. I think, yeah, with Ikiru, because it already has this established reputation, people know what it is based on that reputation by now. You can kind of go into it, whereas the layman might be like, "What is that even mean? What is that?" So I guess that's why this one in particular did.
Yeah, it's always interesting why they choose these translations, and I was just trying to think of some examples of this in the opposite way, because I have seen some movies where if I've gone into the video store or something, or I see it like on the Japanese version of Amazon or something like that,
Mhm.
where it's a Western movie but they'll list it under the Japanese title, and sometimes sometimes it's just the Western title but
Mhm.
written in Japanese characters. Sometimes it is a translation of the title into Japanese language. And sometimes they will choose a completely different title
Hmm.
for the movie,
Yeah.
which is just really kind of like, for example, The Fast and the Furious that series is called Wild Speed here, which is,
Mm.
kind of makes sense. So it's not that
Mhm.
surprising. But there have been other ones that I found that just really kind of strange. And I wish I could think of some examples right now, so I'm sorry if everybody is waiting for me to think of one, but I am having trouble thinking of one offhand. If you email me and you ask me about it, maybe I'll be able to come up with one later, but that was something that kind of stuck out to me as well. And it is kind of interesting to see how they retitle some of these movies, or in this case, don't retitle it. And I thought
Right.
that was interesting because I feel like the English translation of this title, To Live, or like the British version did, just Living, I think is a title that many people would understand. The only reason I could think maybe they didn't do it, well, there are two possible reasons. One is, and this is the uncharitable explanation, is that it sounds a little bit more pretentious to use the original Japanese
Yeah.
title.
Right.
And the more charitable explanation is, and I'm not sure how the release dates coincide or anything like that, but there is a Chinese movie from I think the mid '90s that's also called To Live, is the English title. And maybe, I'm not sure if Criterion released a version of that, but maybe there was some worry about confusion with those two, so they figured that just using Ikiru would be better. I don't know, whatever the case is, but I just thought that's something that's always been interesting to me, is why they chose this title instead of just going with the translation of it. But
Right.
anyway,
Right.
that's a discussion for probably another podcast and another guest with someone who knows a little bit more about this than I do. But Derick, thanks again for coming on. It's always good fun to have you on. So why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, thanks. I always have a good time being on, and yeah, you can find me at the Underrated Movie Podcast. So just put that into your social medias or however you listen to podcasts, or you can just go to underratedmoviepodcast.com and it has all that stuff there. You can also find my writing at places like watchmojo.com or Film Threat if you want to check out some more of my stuff. But yeah, just look up Underrated Movie Podcast. That's the big thing.
Okay, great. We'll have links to some of that stuff in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out. As for us, japanonfilm.com is the website. We are Japan on Film on all the socials, which is pretty much Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads. And we are part of the Film Stories podcast network, so please make sure to check them out and listen up after the credits to hear what is coming up next on the network. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. That is a wrap on season 12 of Japan on Film. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed it. We had a lot of great discussions, a lot of great guests, and we are going to be taking a little bit of a break. But rest assured, I am already starting to put out feelers for season 13. So we will be back in the recording studio, and you'll get more episodes in your feed before you know it. Thanks again for all your support, and we'll catch you next season. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.